He stood quietly at his nephew's grave, a grieving uncle in a dark, tailored suit. But to the two local patrolmen eyeing him from the road, he was just a suspicious black man loitering near a high-end government vehicle. They expected an easy arrest. They triggered a Pentagon firestorm instead. The sky of Oak Ridge Cemetery in Northern Virginia was a bruised, unrelenting gray. A light, freezing drizzle clung to the dark wool coats of the mourners gathered around the freshly dug grave. At the center of the somber assembly was a flag-draped casket holding the remains of Staff Sergeant David Brooks, an Army Ranger who had given his life during a high-risk extraction in the Horn of Africa. Standing a short distance away from the weeping family, seeking a fleeting moment of solitary composure, was David's uncle, General Arthur Pendleton. General Pendleton was a man whose presence commanded rooms before he even spoke a word. With a jawline carved from granite and eyes that had witnessed the bitter realities of Mogadishu, Fallujah, and Kandahar, he was a living legend within the halls of the Pentagon. As a four-star general and the commander of the United States Special Operations Command, Arthur held one of the most powerful military positions on the planet. He commanded hundreds of thousands of elite troops and answered directly to the Secretary of Defense. Today, however, Arthur was not wearing his uniform. The 4 stars, the rows of ribbons, the badges of valor, they were all left at home. Today, he was just Uncle Arthur, a man carrying the unbearable weight of losing the boy he had taught to fish, the boy who had followed him into the military. He wore a simple, impeccably tailored black mourning suit. Per his strict orders, his heavily armed military security detail had hung back. He wanted no fanfare, no salutes, and no distractions from his nephew's service. His armored black government-issued SUV was parked along the curving asphalt path about 50 yards from the grave. Arthur slowly walked over to the vehicle, resting a heavy hand on the cold steel of the hood, bowing his head as he let the silent tears finally fall. From the opposite end of the cemetery, a local municipal police cruiser rolled slowly through the grounds. Inside were Officer Craig Miller and Officer Thomas Reynolds. Miller, the senior officer, was a man with a notorious reputation in the precinct for his short temper and aggressive assumptions. Reynolds, his younger partner, was eager to please and rarely questioned Miller's judgment. They had been dispatched to the cemetery for a routine perimeter check following reports of car break-ins in the area earlier that week. "Check this guy out," Miller said, slowing the cruiser to a crawl. He tapped his finger against the steering wheel, his eyes locked on Arthur Pendleton. Reynolds leaned forward, squinting through the rain-streaked windshield. "The guy in the suit looks like he's just at a funeral, Craig." "Yeah? Look at the car he's leaning on," Miller sneered. "Brand new, heavy-duty Suburban. Tinted out. Look at the plates." Reynolds typed the license plate number into the cruiser's onboard computer. A few seconds later, the system pinged with a glaring red notification. "Arrest restricted, /meist, Department of Defense, do not dataine." "Comes back as a restricted government plate," Reynolds said, a hint of hesitation in his voice. "Duty. Probably belongs to a high-ranking official." Miller scoffed, shifting the cruiser into park. "Or the vehicle was stolen from a motor pool in D.C. and this guy threw a suit on to blend in at a cemetery while he strips whatever is inside. You really think a guy who looks like that is rolling around in a restricted Pentagon vehicle?" Reynolds bit his lip. "I don't know, man. It's a military funeral. It makes sense. I've been on the job 15 years, Tommy. I know when something doesn't look right," Miller interrupted, unbuckling his seatbelt. "He's scoping the car, probably trying to figure out how to bypass the ignition lock. Let's go have a chat." Back at the SUV, Arthur closed his eyes, inhaling the damp, earthy scent of the cemetery. He was thinking of David's final letter, the one that had arrived 2 days after the notification officers had knocked on his sister's door. He was so deep in his grief that he didn't hear the crunch of heavy boots on the wet gravel until they were less than 10 feet away. "Hey, that's buddy. Step away from the vehicle." The harsh, aggressive shout shattered the solemn quiet of the cemetery. Several mourners near the grave, still holding umbrellas, turned their heads in shock. Arthur slowly opened his eyes and turned around. He found himself facing 2 police officers. Their hands were resting menacingly on their utility belts, hovering dangerously close to their sidearms. "Can I help you, officers?" Arthur asked. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, remarkably calm, betraying none of the irritation that was beginning to spark in his chest. "I said step away from the vehicle," Miller barked, closing the distance. He looked Arthur up and down, his eyes filled with unfiltered disdain. "Whose car is this?" Arthur's posture naturally straightened. Years of commanding generals, admirals, and global coalitions had ingrained a posture of undeniable authority in his spine. "The vehicle belongs to the United States government. I suggest you lower your voice, officer. A family is burying their son 50 yards from here." "I don't need you telling me how to do my job," Miller snapped, stepping squarely into Arthur's personal space. "I asked you a question. What are you doing leaning on a federal vehicle?" "Where are the keys?" "The keys are in my pocket," Arthur replied evenly. "Because the vehicle was assigned to me." Miller let out a short, mocking laugh, glancing back at Reynolds. "A single father named, but would unravel his end. Let me guess, you're the Secretary of Defense, or maybe the President?" I am a guest at this funeral," Arthur said, his tone dropping an octave, carrying the distinct edge of a warning. "I am grieving my nephew. I am standing next to my vehicle. I have broken no laws. Now leave me be, and show some respect for the fallen soldier over there." "Respect is earned, pal," Miller hissed. "And right now you're looking like a prime suspect for grand theft auto. Federal plates don't belong to civilians, and they sure as hell don't belong to guys loitering in cemeteries. I want your ID, now." Arthur stared at the officer. For a fraction of a second, the 4-star general considered signaling his security detail. Major John Caldwell and 4 heavily armed plainclothes Delta operators were parked out of sight just beyond the tree line, monitoring the perimeter. One word into the microphone hidden in his lapel, and Miller and Reynolds would be face down in the mud, with federal agents kneeling on their backs. But Arthur stopped himself. He didn't want to ruin David's funeral with a circus. He didn't want his grieving sister to see a brawl erupting over her son's casket. He decided to take the indignity. He would play along, show them his Pentagon identification, and deal with their commanding officer through official channels on Monday morning. "Fine," Arthur said quietly. "My identification is in my breast pocket." Arthur moved his right hand slowly toward the inside of his suit jacket. He deliberately kept his movements telegraphed and unthreatening. A survival instinct born from decades of being a black man in America. An instinct that even 4 stars on his collar could not entirely erase. But Miller was already looking for a reason to escalate. As Arthur's hand slid into his jacket, Miller's training, or rather his paranoid biases, took over. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Miller roared, drawing his taser and aiming the red laser dot directly at the center of Arthur's chest. Reynolds, panicking at his partner's sudden escalation, unholstered his firearm, pointing it at the wet pavement but keeping it ready. "Stop moving. Don't reach for anything." Arthur froze. The freezing rain hit his face. The laser dot danced on his black tie. He looked at the trembling hands of Officer Reynolds, then at the wide, adrenaline-fueled eyes of Officer Miller. The sheer absurdity of the situation hit him like a physical blow. He had survived insurgent ambushes in the Sunni Triangle. He had negotiated with warlords in the mountains of Afghanistan. Now he was standing in a Virginia cemetery moments away from being shot by 2 local cops who couldn't fathom that a black man might legitimately possess a government vehicle. "Officers," Arthur said, his voice entirely devoid of fear, vibrating with a cold, terrifying command. "I am going to say this once, and you are going to listen very carefully. You are making a catastrophic mistake. If you discharge that weapon, the consequences will echo for the rest of your natural lives." Shut your mouth," Miller yelled, stepping forward and grabbing Arthur roughly by the left shoulder. With a violent shove, he spun the general around and slammed him face first against the reinforced bulletproof glass of the SUV. A collective gasp echoed from the mourners. Several of David's military buddies, wearing their dress blues, broke away from the crowd and started jogging toward the commotion, their faces twisted in confusion and anger. "Hands behind your back. Do it now." Miller screamed, driving his knee into the back of Arthur's thigh to force him off balance. Arthur did not resist. He allowed his arms to be wrenched behind his back. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit painfully into his wrists. The metallic click, click, click of the restraints tightening was deafening in the damp air. "You're under arrest for grand theft, impersonating a federal employee and resisting arrest," Miller panted, patting Arthur down aggressively. He reached into Arthur's breast pocket and pulled out a slim, black leather wallet. "Craig, look at the crowd," Reynolds said nervously, noticing the group of angry rangers approaching. "We need to get him in the cruiser, now." "Back off, police business," Miller shouted at the approaching soldiers, resting his hand on his service weapon. The rangers, disciplined but visibly furious to see the grieving uncle of their fallen brother being treated like a criminal, held their ground about 20 feet away. Miller yanked Arthur away from the SUV by the chain of the handcuffs. "Walk," he growled. Arthur turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Miller. There was no anger in the general's expression. There was only a profound, chilling pity. "Open the wallet, Officer Miller," Arthur said softly. "Look at the ID." "I'll look at it when you're in the cage," Miller sneered, marching Arthur toward the police cruiser. He opened the back door and aggressively pushed the older man inside, slamming the door shut with a triumphant thud. Miller walked around to the passenger side where Reynolds was standing. Reynolds looked pale. "Good grab," Miller said, breathing heavily. "Told you he was dirty. Guy had the nerve to threaten me." "Craig, look at his ID," Reynolds said, his voice shaking. He had taken the wallet from Miller's hand and flipped it open. "What? Does he have warrants?" Miller scoffed, leaning over to look at the card in Reynolds' hand. It wasn't a standard driver's license. It was a heavy, encrypted Department of Defense identification card. It bore the seal of the United States Army and the seal of the Department of Defense. Miller's eyes scanned the text. Name, Pendleton, Arthur Dane. Rank, General O10, position, Commander, U.S. Special Operations, Command Clearance. Tot, Scret, / Yankee White. Underneath the text was a photo of the man currently sitting handcuffed in the back of their cruiser. In the photo, he was wearing his Class A uniform. 4 gleaming silver stars sat on his shoulders. The rain seemed to stop for Miller. The world went entirely silent. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. A sudden overwhelming nausea twisted his stomach. O10, a 4-star general. A man who reported to the White House. A man whose security detail was likely. A sudden roar of engines shattered the silence. From the tree line, 3 unmarked black tactical vehicles erupted onto the asphalt, their hidden emergency strobes flashing a blinding combination of red and blue. They moved with terrifying, coordinated precision, accelerating instantly and boxing in the police cruiser in a matter of seconds. The squeal of heavy tires on wet pavement echoed through the headstones. Before the tactical vehicles even came to a complete stop, the doors flew open. "Step away from the cruiser. Step away right now." 8 men in plain clothes wearing tactical vests over their shirts, earpieces, and wielding suppressed short-barreled rifles swarmed the police car. These weren't local cops. These were Army CID special agents and Delta Force operators assigned to the General's protection detail. Major John Caldwell, a fiercely loyal officer who viewed General Pendleton as a father figure, sprinted straight toward Miller and Reynolds. His service pistol was drawn and leveled directly at Miller's chest. "Get your hands in the air. Do it!" Caldwell roared, his voice carrying the authority of the federal government. "Drop the wallet and put your hands on your head." Reynolds instantly dropped the wallet and complied, dropping to his knees in the wet grass, tears welling in his eyes. Miller, completely paralyzed by shock and the sudden presence of assault rifles pointed at his head, slowly raised his hands. Wait, there's a misunderstanding." Caldwell didn't listen. He closed the distance, grabbed Miller by the collar of his uniform, and slammed him violently against the side of the police cruiser. "Where are the keys to the cuffs?" Caldwell demanded, his voice a lethal whisper. "Give me the keys, or I will break your arm and take them myself." Miller fumbled frantically at his belt, producing the small silver key with shaking fingers. Caldwell snatched it and yanked the back door of the cruiser open. General Arthur Pendleton was sitting calmly in the hard plastic seat. He didn't look flustered. He didn't look angry. He simply extended his wrists. Caldwell quickly unlocked the handcuffs, tossing them onto the floorboard of the police car. "Sir, are you injured?" Caldwell asked, his voice tight with suppressed rage. Arthur stepped out of the vehicle, rubbing his wrists slowly. He adjusted his suit jacket and looked at the two local officers. Reynolds was sobbing quietly on his knees. Miller was pinned against the car by two federal agents, his arrogant demeanor completely shattered, replaced by the stark terror of a man who realized he had just ended his own life as he knew it. "I'm uninjured, Major," Arthur said, his voice carrying across the silent cemetery. He looked toward the grave, where David's casket still rested. "But these men have interrupted my nephew's funeral." Arthur walked slowly toward Miller. The federal agents pinned the officer a little harder against the glass. "You asked for my identification, Officer Miller," Arthur said, his tone conversational, which only made it more terrifying. "You assumed I was a thief. You assaulted a superior officer of the United States Armed Forces. You unlawfully detained a federal official." Miller tried to speak, but only a pathetic croak came out. "Sir, General, I was just doing my job." "No," Arthur corrected him softly. "You were doing your prejudice. And now you are going to face the full weight of the United States government." Arthur turned to Major Caldwell. "Secure them. Confiscate their weapons, their radios, and their vehicle. Contact the FBI field office and have the director of the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division on the line in 10 minutes. Then, get the Secretary of Defense on the secure line." "Yes, sir," Caldwell barked. Arthur turned his back on the trembling officers and began the slow walk back to his nephew's grave. The storm he had just unleashed on the local police department was going to be biblical, and the Pentagon was about to make an example out of them that the country would never forget. 10 miles away, the chief of the Oak Ridge Police Department, Robert Haynes, was enjoying a quiet, mundane Tuesday afternoon. He was leaning back in his worn leather chair, sipping lukewarm coffee, completely oblivious to the fact that his career was about to be reduced to ash. The silence of his office was shattered by the shrill ring of his private cell phone. He glanced at the caller ID, an unknown Washington, D.C. area code. Frowning, he answered. "Chief Haynes," a crisp, unyielding voice echoed through the speaker. "This is Paul Abate, Deputy Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I have Attorney General Merrick Garland and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin holding on a secure line. You have exactly 30 seconds to explain why 2 of your patrolmen just assaulted and unlawfully detained the commander of the United States Special Operations Command." Haynes almost choked on his coffee. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly shade of pale. Excuse me? Deputy Director? There must be some mistake. My men are on a routine patrol. There is no mistake, Chief." The booming, unmistakable voice of Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin cut into the call, vibrating with barely contained fury. "Your officers assaulted General Arthur Pendleton. They drew a weapon on him, physically attacked him, and handcuffed him while he was attending the funeral of a fallen Army Ranger. Your department has just committed a federal crime against a 4-star general." Haynes dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the linoleum, splashing brown liquid across his polished shoes. He couldn't speak. His mind short-circuited. "A 4-star general? Listen to me very carefully, Chief Haynes." The Attorney General's voice chimed in, cold and precise. "As of 3 minutes ago, your precinct is the subject of a federal civil rights investigation. FBI hostage rescue teams and agents from the Washington field office are currently securing your perimeter. You are to drive to Oak Ridge Cemetery immediately. You will not issue any commands over the radio. You will surrender your jurisdiction to the federal agents on site. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Haynes whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. When Chief Haynes pulled up to the cemetery 20 minutes later, the scene looked like a military occupation. The local police cruiser was boxed in by heavily armored, unmarked federal vehicles. Men in tactical gear bearing FBI and Army CID patches formed an impenetrable perimeter. Haynes stumbled out of his vehicle, raising his hands instinctively. Major John Caldwell stepped forward to meet him, his face a mask of absolute contempt. "Major, I'm Chief Haynes." "I don't care who you are," Caldwell interrupted, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Look at your men." Haynes looked past the federal agents. Officer Craig Miller and Officer Thomas Reynolds were sitting on the wet curb. They were stripped of their gun belts, their radios, and their badges. Both men were restrained with heavy-duty zip ties. Reynolds was visibly hyperventilating, his face buried in his knees. Miller, the arrogant veteran who thought he owned the streets, stared blankly at the asphalt, his bravado entirely crushed under the sheer, unimaginable weight of his mistake. "General Pendleton ordered us not to make a scene to respect the fallen," Caldwell stated coldly. "So we waited until the casket was lowered. Now the funeral is over, and the real nightmare for your department begins." Two FBI special agents hoisted Miller to his feet. "Craig Miller," one of the agents said, reading from a document, "you are under arrest for assault on a federal officer, unlawful detention, and deprivation of rights under color of law. You are being remanded to federal custody." Miller cried out, panic finally breaking through his shock as the agents dragged him toward a black transport van. "Chief, please, I thought he was stealing the car." "I didn't know." Haynes didn't look at him. He couldn't. He just watched in stunned silence as the federal agents loaded his officers into the vans, knowing that the Department of Justice was about to tear his entire precinct apart. 6 months later, the oak-paneled federal courtroom in Alexandria, Virginia was packed, yet deathly quiet. The fallout from the cemetery incident had been swift, brutal, and public. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division had descended on the Oak Ridge Police Department like a hurricane. A comprehensive federal audit revealed a decade-long pattern of racial profiling, falsified reports, and excessive false complaints that Chief Haynes had actively buried. Haynes was forced into early, disgraced retirement, his pension frozen pending further federal indictments. The entire department was placed under a strict federal consent decree. But the hardest karma was reserved for Craig Miller. Officer Thomas Reynolds had flicked immediately, terrified of federal prison. He testified comprehensively about Miller's long-standing bigotry and aggressive tactics, pleading out to a misdemeanor in exchange for a lifetime ban from any law enforcement or security role. Reynolds was currently working night shifts at a fulfillment warehouse, his career permanently destroyed. Miller, however, refused to take a plea deal. His arrogance convinced him that a jury would sympathize with a veteran cop making an honest mistake. He was wrong. Miller sat at the defense table wearing an ill-fitting gray suit, his face gaunt and aged. The swagger was gone. He looked up as the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. General Arthur Pendleton walked in. This time the general was not in a morning suit. He was wearing his Army service uniform. 4 gleaming silver stars adorned his shoulders. Rows upon rows of multicolored ribbons and medals decorated his chest, a testament to a lifetime of service, valor, and command. He walked with a crisp, measured cadence, projecting an aura of immense, undeniable power. Miller swallowed hard, averting his eyes. The memory of shoving this titan of the American military against a car window suddenly felt like a suicidal fever dream. Arthur took the witness stand. The federal prosecutors stood up. "General Pendleton," the prosecutor began, "could you please recount for the jury the events of November 12th? Arthur's deep baritone voice filled the room. He didn't embellish. He didn't show anger. He simply stated the facts. He described the grief of burying his nephew. He described the sudden, aggressive escalation. He described the laser sight of the taser dancing on his chest. I informed Officer Miller that the vehicle was a federal asset assigned to me," Arthur testified, his eyes locking onto Miller across the room. "I complied with his demands. Despite this, he chose violence. He saw a black man near a high-end vehicle and allowed his prejudice to dictate his actions, discarding his training and his oath." The defense attorney's cross-examination was short and pathetic. There was no defense against the truth, especially when it was backed by the full weight of the Pentagon and the FBI. When the verdict was read, Miller didn't even flinch. Guilty on all federal charges. The judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for corruption, leaned over her bench to address Miller directly before sentencing. "Mr. Miller, you were entrusted with a badge and a gun to protect your community. Instead, you acted as a tyrant. You humiliated a grieving family. You assaulted a decorated military commander. Your actions are a stain on every honest law enforcement officer in this country." She struck her gavel. "I sentence you to 84 months in federal prison without the possibility of early parole." 7 years. Miller collapsed back into his chair, covering his face with his hands as the U.S. Marshals approached to take him into custody. He had lost his badge, his pension, his freedom, and his reputation. Karma had not just knocked on his door, it had kicked it down and taken everything he owned. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the Virginia hills, casting long golden shadows across the grass, Arthur Pendleton returned to Oak Ridge Cemetery. He wore civilian clothes again, a simple jacket and jeans. He walked the 50 yards from the asphalt path to David's grave. The earth had settled over the past 6 months, and a polished marble headstone now marked the spot. Arthur knelt, placing a small bouquet of white lilies at the base of the stone. The cemetery was quiet, free from the roar of sirens or the shouts of angry men. There was only the gentle rustle of the wind through the oak trees. "We got it sorted out, David," Arthur whispered softly, tracing his fingers over the engraved letters of his nephew's name. "Rest easy, soldier. I've got the watch." Arthur stood up, took a deep breath of the cool evening air, and walked back to his vehicle. Justice had been served, the storm had passed, and finally the general could mourn in peace. If this story of ultimate karma and justice sent chills down your spine, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to see this. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our gripping real-life drama stories. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on how General Pendleton handled the situation. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more.